Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. I'm joined again by Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, and Right Ruminations. We're going to discuss who are the ruling class. So this sort of gets is riffing off of an earlier discussion Keith and I had last week, where we were talking about what exactly is the ruling class? The left today still seems to have this 19th century mentality that the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie that own the factories, are the ruling class, even though we live in a post-industrial society. And the sort of Daddy Warbucks, villain with the monocle just doesn't really, he doesn't exist in that form anymore. The ruling class is still there, but it's a different set of class interests. It's a different set of material conditions, and it's not a terribly useful analytical tool at this point. So Keith, why don't you sort of explain the problem with this sort of dated view of the ruling class and who you think the ruling class actually is?
Well, I think we have to define the ruling class much more broadly, obviously, than what the ruling class was considered to be in the 19th century, although there are certain, I guess, prototypes that we can draw on from that time period that might help us define what the ruling class in a contemporary sense would be. The term ruling class, of course, for the Marxists means those who control the means of production, which means, in their time at least, it meant factories and feudal plantations and agricultural plantations and the mines and workshops and those kinds of things. And then I guess in a modern sense, it would be the means of production in a wider sense, like just heavy industry and now high technology and all those kinds of things. But while I think we can certainly say that a lot of that does comprise a segment of the ruling class has got to be understood much more broadly than that, and it's got to be understood in terms of the changes that have taken place since the 19th century. For example, since the 19th century, obviously we've developed states that are much more extensive. The state now, what we call the public administration state, extends into virtually every aspect of life in a way that it would not have in the 19th century. Or more recently than that even. So the state has an interest of its own that is apart from that of any particular economic interest. Now, the Marxists will say that the state is merely the executive committee of the ruling class or something like that, which isn't entirely true, because the state as an entity has its own interests. There are rivalries within the state. The state itself is comprised of a lot of different entities that often have competing objectives. So we've got the state, and of course, when we talk about the state, we have to talk about not only the political class, the elected officials and lawmakers and all of that, executives, but we also have to talk about the administrative bureaucracies and the ways in which administrative bureaucracies take on a life of their own and have their own interests within the framework of the wider state apparatus that they're a part of. So we've got these two things. We've got the controllers of means of production, and then we've got the state apparatus and all of its different component parts. I believe we talked about this a little bit last time, but in the 20th century, you started to have theorists of things like the managerial revolution develop, or theorists of the new class develop. And that is this idea that within mass societies and modern societies of the kind we have today, that the managerial class, that is those kinds, the people who simply manage all of these mass institutions that are a part of modern societies, whether it's government, whether it's corporations or financial institutions or militaries or philanthropies or foundations or universities or any other kind of mass organization, that the managerial class wields a great deal of power in all of these different sectors. So we've got controllers of means production, we've got the state apparatus, we've got the managerial class. We can even see that there are, within the managerial class, we might have the social bureaucracy that emerged with the expansion of the welfare state, coming into conflict with the corporate bureaucracy that manages the mass corporations. You see conflicts of that type. Another thing that has to be considered is the knowledge industry. There's an elite theorist by the name of William Domhoff who's from the left, and he's argued that there are four basic networks that define the ruling class of a particular society, and that's the political class, the political elites, the economic elites, the military elites, and then what he called the knowledge elites or the educational elites, or those who disseminate values in a society. In a medieval society, it might be something like the church, but in a modern society like our own, it would be the mass media and the educational system and things like that. So you've got this entire range of institutions and organizations and individuals that collectively could be called the ruling class, or of course, in the U.S., given recent political events in the U.S., we've been hearing a lot about the deep state. The deep state is basically just the permanent security forces in the state, military and things like that, armaments. That's obviously a major component of the ruling class. So all of these things are interconnected with each other, and yet they're somewhat independent of each other as well, in the sense that you have within the ruling class a lot of different competing interests. I've noticed that just like people on the left make the mistake of saying, well, the ruling class is those who control the means of production, this kind of narrow Marxist framework. On the right, I have seen different similar mistakes, I think. Like, I know there are some conservatives who talk a great deal about, well, the ruling class is, the government bureaucracy, primarily the public sector, social services and sectors, or the ruling class is the university elites and the mass media and the cultural elite and the wine and cheese crowd and stuff like that. And what they're attacking is they're attacking this class because that class often has values that they don't like the class that they're attacking, the academic elite, media elite, cultural elite, sectors of the public sector elite, at least certain sectors of the public sector. They tend to be more leftward leaning than a lot of conservatives typically are. So they'll say, well, that's the ruling class. I know there's a writer by the name of Angelo Codavia who's written in this vein quite a bit, but I think that's a somewhat misguided point of view as well. I mean, just because people have values you don't like doesn't mean they're the ruling class per se. Even when they have power and influence, that doesn't make them the ruling class. They can still be just a segment of the ruling class or an element within the ruling class, and I think that's a better way to look at it from that kind of perspective. Also, we've got to consider the fact that the ruling class extends on an international basis. You've got a lot of institutions that exist within particular countries that are extremely powerful and influential, but then that extends outward on an international level. You have transnational corporations that in many societies now have as much or more wealth and power and influence than many national governments do. And parallel to that, you have international political and quasi-political organizations and military organizations, the UN and NATO and all the different organizations that are interconnected with that, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, all the international banking cartels, and then you've got the tech companies that are intertwined with all of that, and then you've got the military organizations that are interconnected to it. So all of these things are collectively, I think, part of what we would call a ruling class today in a way that exists on both a national and international level.
Yeah, I like that sort of more holistic approach. In one regards, the classic left analysis of the capitalist owning the means of production is the ideas that are disseminated that the people believe to be true, you believe these values to be a good person, are really the product of media and the university. The university teaches people that these are the right opinions to hold, and the media says if you want to be successful or attractive, these are the right ideas that you have to hold. And so together, they sort of fulfill the role that the church used to serve in previous generations. And this is interesting too, because if you look at class power analysis, the left never criticizes the university and the left never criticizes Well, the media sometimes they'll criticize it for being corporatist, but generally where the media is doing its obviously propagandizing work to make people woke, well, they don't criticize that. They never criticize that. But of course, that's the power elite disseminating what good thoughts are through the media. And so it is interesting that it's a bit of a blind spot, that the left will just go on and on and on about, maybe the military industrial complex, maybe, this or that large firm that was, guilty with some sort of misdemeanor like Bernie Madoff or something, or the 2007, 2008 economic crisis. But, the universities, all the scams. I mean, just last year, there was that big scandal about liberal parents paying for their kids to be put at the top of the list to get into schools. That's a level of corruption just as serious as Bernie Madoff, but nobody cared. The left didn't include that in its class analysis. So it is interesting that those elements of the ruling class largely escape the ire of the left. What are some of your thoughts about ruminations on this thus far?
Well, something that struck me while you were talking is that the way the mainstream culture has misdefined fascism, and the way I think a lot of people were brought up to define fascism as being a convergence of government and corporate interests, which is something that Mussolini actually never said, but is often misattributed to him. That misconception of what fascism is actually a good description, I think, of what the ruling elite is. That is, it's not purely business interest, it's not purely bureaucratic interest, but it's a convergence of a parallel interests who are not necessarily on the same page, but kind of together compose this sort of common a club with which to rule over society. And I'm not convinced that this is something new. I think that actually that false definition of fascism is basically something that probably to some extent defines what the ruling class has been mostly throughout history. So, for example, even in the Soviet Union, there had to be some degree of economic liberalization in order to stimulate the economy and in order to, I suppose, get a better hold over manufacturing interests and almost a kind of gesture towards the function that a ruling elite within the commercial sector has to play. And likewise, in capitalist societies, there is always some kind of outreach by the capitalists to the state in order to kind of take up the bureaucratic end of things. And so I think that it always has, there's always a component of commercial interest as well as bureaucratic, and I suppose by definition, anti-commercial interests in any society ranging from neoliberal societies to communist societies. There's always this parallel. But on the other hand, there's also I think the question of to what extent is the ruling class just the traditional tribal arrangement of the alpha male wielding the club, and then everyone kind of looks to him for guidance, and it's like this biological instinct, or to what extent is it something that's more rational or more in keeping with public choice theory. And I think that there's a convergence there as well. I think that the ruling elite, in terms of why it's operating, is always going to be a combination of some kind of biological imperative to have the strong center, the sort of patriarchal role model. But on the other hand, there's always this element of calculation, of various conscious class interests trying to utilize that structure as much as they can. Another thing that has struck me is the extent to which, kind of contrary to the description of the world that the paleo-conservatives point out, I think that there's always been an aspect of the ruling class that has been international and imperial. You see this with the old families of Europe intermarrying with one another even while they were at war with the same states. I forget who Jonathan Pohl was quoting when he said this, but he said, an American elite washes up on the shore of China and he's still a ruling elite. So it's the ruling elite, even while It is seen as necessary to maintain ethnic composition within a given geographical area. And insofar as even while it is tribal in focus necessarily, there's always an element of it which is trans-ethnic, which is trans-tribal. And maybe that speaks more to the calculated or rationalistic aspect of the ruling class, even while there's this more anthropological naturalist function of being the sort of tribal or ethnic leader. So I guess the main takeaway from all of these strands of thought is that the ruling elite is a convergence of different factors, different types of interests, and different types of anthropological functions, which makes it very complicated to talk about.
Yeah, Swithun, what are some of your thoughts?
I would broadly agree with the conclusions that most of you have come to with this, although I think I would take a slightly different theoretical standpoint towards it. And I think Right Ruminations touched on it with respect to the biological imperative and the sort of rational aspects of the ruling class. I think it's interesting to possibly define the ruling class as those people who ultimately wield their influence via the law in a certain respect, because it is through law that people rule, as opposed to just sort of conquer other nations. It's when it's sort of settled society in which certain people can influence society. And even in sort of Ancapistan, as it were, would still have a ruling class of sorts. If you look at Hopper's work, this would really be his natural elites, who are the ones who are the people considered of higher intellect and wisdom to dispense justice, which would be originally on a sort of settled body of norms, which wouldn't necessarily be created in a positive sense, but would be discovered over time and just enforced as sort of a natural law, as it were. In this, so there would be a ruling class of sorts. That said, in Ancapistan, there'd be free legal entry to dispense arbitration services. So even though there is a ruling class, as such, those who sort of dispense justice or those who influence the legal norms which prevail in such a system, it's not privileged in the same way as it is when you have the emergence of the state. And if we define the state, broadly speaking, for this purpose as the monopolist over law, effectively, who then prevents other people from entering to dispense legal services, even though they may follow the same standards of evidence, they may consider the same things illegal as the state finds illegal, but because they are not the state, they are forcibly prevented from providing such services. And in that situation, you then have a more malevolent ruling class coming into existence that would otherwise pertain, because they are now in a legally privileged position in a way that they weren't previously, in that they can forcibly prevent others from entering. And so from this, it is likely that things like taxation and other legal positivism will follow, which will benefit those who are a member of this ruling class. So what you have, I would say then, is the ruling class are those elites who benefit directly or indirectly from government expropriation and legal privileges. So this would include organizations like corporations with limited liability, things like intellectual property, land grants to give to large corporations, the banks with central banking, because you only have one body that can create the money supply in a particular jurisdiction. Then, of course, the permanent bureaucracies, the military-industrial complex. You also have, so with the military-industrial complex, you have nominal private organizations, such as Lockheed Martin, who, and I have never looked at their accounts, but I'd be surprised if their contracts weren't at least 50% plus from the state. And if the state is your major customer, you're not a private firm. You're basically an arm of the state. The same thing would go for things like private prisons, those things, and the permanent bureaucracies that Keith has mentioned. And something I haven't really talked about as much as I could have done so far is even if you go back to sort of the natural elites, the question arises, where does the body of law come from? That refers to natural law, not necessarily in a specific sense with reference to followers of Aristotle or Aquinas, but more in a sense of that it was sort of generally agreed in a particular society this was the case. That needs some sort of propagating force to some extent to sort of influence society in what is considered good or bad practice. And sort of traditionally that would have been the church. So even if they weren't natural elites as such, in sort of well, Hopper would consider to some extent medieval Europe non-state-like. Whether that's true or not is another question. But leaving that aside, the church would act as sort of like the, and as it were, the legitimizing ideology of any of the sort of arbitration services, really, if you put it in that sort of ANCAP framework. And then consequently, as Keith has pointed out, the elite media today is clearly the legitimizing, at least part of the legitimizing ideology of the state. And as Todd mentioned, universities, and in particular, mass democracy as sort of the legitimizing ideology of the official recognition of who our rulers are, whether that's, well, it's a massive sham anyway, but so intellectuals who would, Francis Fukuyama would be an interesting whipping boy here, with democracy being the end of history, and people like that in universities. Those are required from the current ruling class to give intellectual veneer to what is really privilege, special privileges to particular groups, and living at the expense of others via taxation, and also the printing press, which is effectively another form of tax. So that would be my sort of theoretical view as to the origin, as it were, of the ruling class, although my conclusions are broadly in agreement with Keith's.
Yeah, the other thing that gets back to the question that started this in Keith's observation is according to left-wing class rhetoric and race rhetoric, is that the ruling class are the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now, we don't kind of know who those people are and were, and at one point they were the United States ruling class. Now, in a matter of in a period of unique self-awareness, I can't think of his name now. He's the Indian guy on MSNBC. He's always doing economics. Name escapes me, but he pointed out that the ruling class did, under the WASPs, have this idea of the common good. So, for example, the fact that so many first-class people died on the Titanic to make room for women and children. Inconceivable that men that paid first class today on a sinking ship would forfeit their lives for women and children from second and third class. They wouldn't do that today. And the fact is, it's obvious the ruling class is not the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. For the first time in history, the U.S. Supreme Court, which the Anti-Federalists pointed out was the most important arm of government, because it was the Supreme Court that was entrusted with interpreting the Constitution. As such, it was in charge with interpreting its own limitations, which is a bit of a joke, because if you interpret your own limitations, you don't have any limitations. But who's on the Supreme Court? Well, to throw a bone to our tanky friends, there's a lot of rootless cosmopolitans on the Supreme Court, and there's a lot of Catholics on the Supreme Court. I don't see any Protestants on the Supreme Court, even though the United States is 50% Protestant, and it's historically been a Protestant country. Furthermore, it's racially diverse. We've got, Latinos, we've got Irish, we've got Italians, and we've got rootless cosmopolitans. I don't see any waspy white people on the Supreme Court anymore. So if the most important arm of government is not controlled by WASPs, then WASPs are not in charge. Furthermore, being a man or being white or being Protestant confers no legal privilege anymore. So by definition, they can't be the ruling class because there's no privilege attached to any one of those traits. There is a lot of privilege if you're a woman, if you're a black person, if you're a whole host of other things. And again, these people that do, but here's another thing too, because what the left seems to want is to just want to paint by numbers. They want to have the same ruling class apparatus with colored people and women. So, Kamala Harris is a black woman, but, she was called out, and, it turns out that she was betraying her principles all throughout her career. And nobody really cares because it's just paint by numbers, right? Get a black woman in there and the ruling class apparently doesn't exist anymore. So there is this weird time loop where the left in general thinks that white Protestants are still in charge when they haven't been in charge for at least 50 years, and that the ruling class ceases to be the ruling class when their people are in charge. I'll hand this one over to Keith.
Well, the issues that you have raised are issues that I think have to do more with the question of what are the cultural dynamics of the ruling class, like what I was talking about earlier. And I gave a pretty broad overview, but I was talking about more of the institutional apparatus of the ruling class, which theoretically can be neutral as far as the cultural composition of the ruling class. I was talking about, well, we've got the state and all of its different component parts, and the corporate, banking, financial, industrial, technological sector and all of its component parts, and the knowledge sector and ideas industries and all their component parts, and military and state security forces. That doesn't necessarily, all of those are part of the ruling class, but they don't necessarily imply any one set of cultural norms or cultural or any kind of identity. Of course, the main grievance that the left raises against the ruling class, however they define it, is, well, the ruling class is all straight white male, Christian, whatever, as you were saying earlier. Of course, the people on the right turn that around and say, well, not so fast. As you were just pointing out, Todd, the Supreme Court, which is the highest judicial body in the land, to my knowledge, doesn't have any Protestants on it at this point. I may be wrong about that. I'm not a real Supreme Court follower. But, but if you look at who's on the Supreme Court of the 9, you've got one African-American man, one Jewish woman, one Hispanic woman. I think the male members of the court are predominantly, or maybe entirely Catholic. Probably all of them are Catholic, except Ruth Ginsburg, I guess, is Jewish. But so that does raise, I think, important questions about, what is the cultural component of the ruling class? What is the ethnic component of the ruling class? And that's where a lot of the battles over identity politics and that kind of thing come into play in contemporary discourse, because you have the two sides going back and forth saying that, everything's controlled by straight white Christian males, and the other side saying, well, oh no, everything is controlled by people of color and women and LGBTs and secular humanists and Catholics and whatever. But I think that is an interesting question in terms of to what degree do different cultural and ethnic sectors comprise the ruling class or outside the ruling class. And I tend to have a somewhat mixed view on that, because I think it's certainly true that of all the cultural changes that have happened certainly in the United States and in the Western world in the last 50 or 60 years, what we've seen now is an extreme diversification of the ruling class, where it used to be, yes, the ruling class were all WASPs, at least in America, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Nowadays, I think I've seen statistics that say a third of all billionaires in the U.S. are Jewish. I've seen others that talk about how the Catholic component of the ruling class is growing. So it's certainly there's a great deal more religious diversity, in addition to the fact that the influence of religion generally has declined. And then, of course, you look at, again, to use Todd's analogy, the Supreme Court, you've got a third of the Supreme Court are now female. Record high numbers of members of Congress are female. I saw an article a while back profiling all these women who were CEOs of defense companies. Like, these are companies that are part of the military-industrial complex, and they have these female CEOs now. I know all the time I've seen articles bragging about now we have record numbers of female, police chiefs and judges and district attorneys and prison wardens and corporate executives and all these other things. So it seems that what has happened is that the ruling class, in its wider sense, has become much more integrated along cultural and ethnic and gender and religious lines than certainly we would have seen half a century ago. Now, as far as which one is dominant, I think it depends on the different sectors. If you look at the different sectors of the U.S. ruling class, for instance, among the Republicans, for example, right now, and for probably the last 40 years, maybe longer, a lot of the Republican Party's financial backing has come from the Sun Belt industries, which tend to be located throughout the South and the Southwest, Texas oil and Arizona and Midwestern agriculture and that kind of stuff. And the Republican Party still has a very WASP-ish component to it, although it represents sectors of U.S. society that were once dominant that are certainly in decline. I mean, the only reliable constituency for the Republicans nowadays are older white Protestants. On the other side of the fence, you see that among the people that generally support the Democratic Party, at least the elite interest, you see the rise of these newer, more high-tech industries that have come about in more recent times, the social media companies and the big technology companies and the mass media conglomerates and all of this kind of stuff. And all of that is much, much more diverse culturally and more, I guess, relatively speaking, leftward leaning politically. And it's more in tune with woke culture and all of this kind of stuff than what you would find on the other side of the spectrum. And a lot of that, I think, gets into this culture war stuff that we have in the U.S. today. We have this, there are a lot of people who interpret U.S. politics to say, well, now it's just simply about race. It's simply about whites versus the people of color, or a broader interpretation. I think one that's more accurate is, well, it's the traditional WASP culture, broadly defined, versus the whatever is outside that, which includes an amalgam of a lot of different things. I think that's probably more accurate. But then that gets into the question of whether the ruling class is dependent on any particular type of ethnic or cultural identity. Like Sam Francis, for example, more or less had the idea that, well, you could have the managerial state and the managerial ruling class that that James Burnham wrote about, and just change personnel. You could change its orientation towards being more of a paleo-conservative managerial elite as opposed to a left-liberal managerial elite, or a post-bourgeois capitalist, as he called it, managerial elite. I'm somewhat, I think that's probably true in the sense that, yes, you could have the same institutional apparatus and have changes ethnic and cultural orientation somewhat, and that's actually happening. You actually see situations, for example, now where you in the corporate sector, in the industrial sector, in the state sector, you get more and more people in those sectors who are managing the same institutions that have always been there, and yet they're trying to push them in this more seemingly left-wing direction of, now the Federal Reserve needs to put up rainbow flags during Pride Month. I mean, it's still the same old Federal Reserve we always had. Or in the corporate sector, you have these woke capitalist corporations that have their diversity initiatives, and they celebrate Pride Month, and they put a rainbow flag on their products during Pride Month, or they have and they brag about how many minority employees they have. But it's still the same system. It's still the same kind of I mean, the institutional structures haven't changed a bit. Now, one thing I think I might disagree with a lot of conventional libertarians or ANCAPs on is the question of what is the particular location of the state in this whole ruling class nexus. Some libertarians have framed the question of, well, there's net tax consumers and then there's net taxpayers. The problem I see with something like that is I wouldn't see somebody who's unemployed and who lives on welfare as part of the ruling class. I mean, say whatever you want about that kind of situation, but I don't see somebody who's simply a public sector charge as part of the ruling class. I think that's problematic. I wouldn't see somebody who's simply employed in the public sector in the state sector as part of the ruling class, like a janitor at the public school or something like that. I mean, that's obviously not part of the ruling class. So I think to have a real analysis of what the ruling class is, it's got to be more than just the particular institutional nexus that somebody's a part of. It has to be their role in that institutional apparatus. Like, I think I tend to look at it in terms of, well, I guess it comes down to power and non-power. Who is it that actually has the ability to direct and control the actions of others and make it stick? Like, who can say, these are my orders, you will obey them, or there's going to be a problem? And there are plenty of people in the private sector, the public sector, wherever, who can't do that. I mean, a public sector employee who's just shuffling papers somewhere generally can't do that. The janitor at the Fortune 500 company, he can't do that. It's those at the top of this whole wider intersection of institutions that comprise the ruling class. Going back to what James Burnham said about the managerial elite, they're the ones that really pull the strings. I mean, they're the ones that really say, okay, we're the ones that decide whether there's going to be a war. We're the ones that decide whether there's going to be what monetary policy is going to be, or what tax policy is going to be, or whether we're going to get this body of legislation constructed and put through the legislative branches of government, or what the general approach to trade policy is going to be. And of course, that emanates out into a lot of other things. Like Todd was talking about the Supreme Court. Well, how much power do they ultimately have? Now, I tend to look at it like the role of the courts, at least in the U.S., is to simply arbitrate disputes between rival factions of the elite and generally govern according to the dominant consensus of elite. I mean, if you look at the history of the different Supreme Courts, you see these constant paradigm shifts where the court starts to reflect a new paradigm based on the consensus of elite at the time. I mean, a good example is the Lochner decision from the late 19th century, where the Supreme Court basically ruled in favor of laissez-faire, something that would really make Ayn Rand happy. In fact, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said in his dissent from that decision, he says, now, wait a minute, the Constitution doesn't mandate Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics, meaning that the Constitution is not necessarily this, complete laissez-faire charter for a political economy. But that was the consensus at the time. Then in the 1960s and 50s, 60s, and 70s, you see the much hated Earl Warren Court that the conservatives dislike greatly, but you do see there's a concerted effort to move things much further to the left than what they had once been in the United States. And then for a time, you had the Reagan appointees on the Supreme Court, reflecting this kind of neoliberal revolution. Well, maybe we need to be more friendly to business interests and less friendly to, say, criminal rights or something like that. But I think all of that functions within this wider elite consensus that develops about how elites see their own interest and assess their own values and things like that. And then the courts are a reflection of that, because the people who get on the courts, even the Supreme Court, are products of the law schools and elite universities where the law schools are located, and then they have to go through a process of being appointed to the judiciary and confirmed by Congress and all that. And they don't do that. They don't get that far if they're too far out of the elite consensus. Like we're not going to see an anarcho-capitalist attorney getting appointed to the Supreme Court, by anybody anytime soon, or somebody with the ideology of Noam Chomsky is not going to be on the Supreme Court anytime soon. So I think that's how I would see the courts. And I do think that while on one hand institutions can be value neutral apart from things like culture and ethnicity and identity and stuff like that, I think that it's also true that the institutions that exist will be reflective of the dominant culture and the dominant identity orientation that you find in any particular society at any one time.
Yeah, exactly. I think, sort of maybe to express what you're getting at, the ethnic religious composition of the ruling class is distinct from the institution itself and could theoretically be replaced with another set. But the goals for which the institution is used is determined by the ethnic religious makeup of the class. And some ethnic religious classes are more amenable to the interests of the machinery of power as such. And you mentioned about who actually has power. I mean, you mentioned this in another context. Obviously, a homeless white man living on the street doesn't have white privilege. It's just ludicrous. Swithun, what are some of your thoughts?
I'm sure someone would claim that the homeless man does have white privilege because he'll get more in his panhandle than the black man would. So he's the privileged homeless man. I'm certain someone would argue that somewhere. Just on the ethnic composition of the ruling class, I think there's an interesting. It's certainly true for any given structure. It doesn't particularly matter what the ethnic and sort of values of the people who hold them are, within particular bounds. Obviously, you're not going to have Ron Paul running the Federal Reserve, for example. But you can, broadly speaking, have the same sorts of different sorts of ethnicities, races, etc., on them, and you can pretty much continue the ruling class as it effectively has always run. The interesting question, I think, though, is as society changes more ethnically and culturally, is whether or not the ruling class can exist in its current form, and whether or not you'll get to a particular point where there's a critical mass within the overall society, which means that the way in which the ruling class will have to operate will have to change. So the obvious examples there would be certain secessionist movements. I really think I really want Trump to win 2020 just so California can really try to leave. I mean, they won't allow them to happen. But imagine that it did. Then this will change the objective parameters of how the ruling class can actually function, because they've now only got 49 states and probably about a quarter of the GDP. I can't remember the distributions, but California's pretty darn high. So, and then also just the general points with respect to sort of polarization amongst the electorate and the country at large, whether the current legitimizing ideology of the ruling class is going to be able to be maintained, where you have large cultural differences, and then will be increasing ethnic diversity, especially if you look at birth rates. Isn't it? I think, is it 2050 when the US did I read that?
Around there, that's the prediction. Yeah,
2050 will not be majority white. I mean, that's going to make a difference. I mean, you don't have to be a biological determinist to say that, but there's clearly huge cultural differences with respect to sort of Catholic Latinos and extended family and sort of more, we could say, traditional patriarchal society in certain respects than the more nuclear family, more relatively individualist white Anglo-Saxon Protestant society. And this is going to make a big sort of cultural shift, which is going to mean that I think the institutions that exist would have to alter, at least to some extent. I may be wrong. It may be so malleable that you'd be able to maintain most of them, but I think, well, it's certainly the case that the ruling class institutions are different today than they were 100 years ago, at least in certain respects. And I think you might get something similar in the next 30 to 40 years. So that's what I was saying. I'm just a back thing on the libertarian thing. I think Keith is right. The libertarians focusing on people who are net tax receivers and net taxpayers. That's actually one of Hopper's arguments from his Austrian Marxist class analysis, which, as you point out, mistakes those people who rule from those who are just a beneficiary of the system. And also he ignores people who receive particular legal privileges who would earn significantly more than they otherwise would, and those who are prevented from earning more than they otherwise would with licensing laws, etc., so that they might actually earn enough such that they would not actually be net tax receivers in that system. It's a little bit more difficult to quantify who is a beneficiary and who isn't, but it would recognize the influence of the state in a more broader sense. So
yeah, the other thing is when you point out these ethnic compositions, for example, George Lopez will repeatedly make jokes about how Hispanics will come over to America to game the welfare system, and it's funny. But when some white guy points it out, he's a Nazi. Like, George Lopez admits it in his comedy skits. It's like this is an open secret, right? I mean, that's part of how this works. I feel like the power elite realized that to placate the left, all they really had to do was just play by numbers. If the leadership of the power elite were people of color and women, then everybody would shut up. And it does seem to have worked that way. The anti-war movement disappeared as soon as Obama became president. Right, ruminations.
Well, I think that we can tie in this discussion of changes in ethnic and gender composition with something that Swithun mentioned earlier, which is the question of how do we come up with these particular arrangements? What is, maybe not in an Aristotelian or a Thomistic sense, but generally speaking, what is the natural law that's being appealed to? And I think that mistakes the way these things even happen. I think that the ruling elite is highly phenomenological in that it just happens due to sets of circumstances. So let me explain that. There's an experiment where they put rats in a situation where there was a scarcity of food, and in those circumstances there'd be a kind of very articulated gender dynamic where all of the female rats would be very submissive and all of the male rats would be very aggressive. But then they introduced an abundance of food, and also all of a sudden the female rats became very corpulent, and all of the male rats became very timid towards these the new version of the female rats. Likewise, in the glory of the Roman Empire, they decided to allow the Germanic tribes to start entering into their territory. Now, something tells me that if you had some hard up tribe in the rainforest or something, that is probably not going to be all that worried about accommodating other tribes and letting them in. So in other words, I think that a lot of this alteration in ethnic and sex composition in the ruling elite is just the result of what happens when you introduce, when you give people a bunch of stuff. That it's inevitable that there is a position of luxury, and from that people start becoming experimental, and people can afford to demand things that they weren't able to demand before. And it reminds me of something that the men's rights activist Paul Elam said, which I think can be applied to more broadly to questions other than sex relations. He said, we have quite literally worked ourselves out of a job. I think that in a sense the Roman Empire worked itself out of a job. I think that America is working itself out of a job. Now, this is not meant to be an indictment of capitalism. I'm not saying that it's necessarily even avoidable, but what I am saying is that it's, I think, a mistake to say that we come up with an arrangement of this is how we do things, or this is the theory by which we will govern things. These are the terms of the ruling elite. I think that the terms are always being redrawn as far as the circumstances will permit. So, like under a period of scarcity, the ruling elite would, I think, by necessity be more ethnocentric and ethno-homogenous, whereas when it can afford to be indulgent and luxurious, it will inevitably kind of start to redraw the terms by which it operates. And this is one thing that I think kind of endears me to the early American Republic. Not that it in any way avoided this, but I think it may have mitigated the effects of this in the sense that it actually decided to behave as if things did work the way Swithun suggests. That is, they actually decided, all right, let's draw up the rules and decide, well, this is how society is going to work, and here are the kind of terms of service, terms of agreement. But I think that in the long run, what we're looking at in terms of these alterations is not necessarily an ideology first transformation, but rather it's that the terms of arrangement, the terms of service between the ruled and the rulers is basically being updated to in light of change in economic and environmental circumstances.
All right. Well, now we're nearing the end of the hour, so we'll start with final statements. Keith, I'll give you the first final statement.
I think that some of the latter part of the conversation when we're talking about the values and essentially the ideology that guides the elite and the ruling class and institutions, and to what degree can the institutions be separated from the culture and things like that. I think what we're really getting there is to at least on one level is this question of legitimacy. For any set of institutions to exist and have any kind of durability, they have to have a perception of legitimacy. Most people in society have to think that institutions are legitimate to at least some degree. There's always going to be critics and dissidents and things like that. But in a society where people think their institutions are just a complete sham, a society like that's not going to last indefinitely. In fact, I'd argue that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union and the former Eastern European states, that's probably the main reason why those states are no longer with us, is because those states were corrupt to the point that just nobody took them seriously. Everybody thought, well, this is a joke. I mean, even a lot of members of the elite thought it was a joke. The issue there, I think, is does the perception of legitimacy come from the elite, or does it come from something wider? Does it come from the wider culture? And I think it's something of a symbiotic relationship, in the sense that elites will try to create what the Marxists call an ideological superstructure for themselves that is certainly reflective of their own interests, but they understand they have to do this in a way that is acceptable to substantial sectors of society. I mean, they understand that large numbers of the people, quote unquote, have to consent to this, or at least tacitly consent to this. Now, I'm not saying this is conspiracy either. I'm not saying there's a bunch of elite people sitting around in a room somewhere saying, well, what's going to be our legitimating ideological superstructure? I think it's more of a case of, well, you have people among the ranks of power elites who have their own needs and interests, and they're just looking for ways to advance that. And they say, okay, well, if we say this will work. If we say that, or do this, or make this concession, or appeal to this group, or whatever. And out of that, you start to see a set of prevailing norms that define the state. For example, in traditional American society, you have this thing called the American civil religion that Robert Bellow wrote about back in the 1960s. And he said that if you look at the content of the American civil religion, it's a sort of nationalistic religion that has this American exceptionalism component with some quasi-deist type of theological views, but in a way that's also providential and is almost biblical in a way. So you've got sort of an America-centric, half Enlightenment rationalist, half traditional, Judeo-Christian or whatever worldview and fits, the American narrative into that. Now we've started to see that change in the last half century. We've seen that gradually change, where it's not just America as God's country or whatever, but we see, we see this narrative changing where, this is America's the land of land of the melting pot. Our diversity is our strength, and you also even have a redemption narrative. Well, in the past we were overcome with the sins of sexism and racism and homophobia, but unfortunately now we've overcome that and and Saint Martin Luther King died for our sins, and he's now a national icon. And we see that kind of thinking being incorporated into the ideological superstructure of the state. At the same time, when they're taking down the Confederate monuments and stuff like that, they're saying, well, these are the sins of the past. We're washing away our sins of the past, and we're gonna have Martin Luther King Boulevard rather than say Robert E. Lee Boulevard or something like that. But it's a very dynamic process, and I think Right Ruminations is correct when he says it's always shifting, and what's going to be the norm today is not necessarily going to be the norm even in 20 years. For instance, there was a controversy going on. I'm not sure where this stands now, but at one point they wanted to put Harriet Tubman, who was the escaped slave woman from the 19th century. They wanted to put her on one of the postage stamps, I think, in place of one of the presidents or something like that.
No, real quick, I think it was actually one of the currency to replace Andrew Jackson.
Oh, okay, interesting. But and I'm sure in the future they'll probably put gay rights icons on the currency or something like that, or we'll have schools. We may already have, let's say, an elementary school named after Harvey Milk or somebody like that, because all of that reflects the ongoing cultural consensus about what it is that gives the system its legitimacy. If you ask people off the street what gives the American political system, economic system, its legitimacy, you're going to get a range of answers, and some of them aren't going to be very consistent, and some aren't going to be coherent or intelligible. But generally speaking, it'll be something like, because this is America and this is a land of opportunity, and you can make money here, and we have gay rights, and whatever else, we have Hollywood, and we have, it's all going to depend on the person's frame of reference. But that right there is currently the consensus. The current consensus is, this is America's a society where you can make money and you have equal rights to be gay, or we're the melting pot, diversity is our strength, that kind of stuff. And in the future, it might be something different. It might be something further to the left, for example. Or it may be, or the pendulum could swing the other way. It could become something that's a little bit more conservative. But I think, though, that's really the crux of the whole cultural issue. That is, the state is, and the culture, and the elite and the culture, the power elite and the culture have this kind of symbolic relationships where the elite tries to bend the culture towards their own interests, but they have to draw on the culture as well.
All right, Right Ruminations, final statements.
Well, my final statement would be just to reiterate what I said, that it's the ruling elite is a convergence of different factors, part commercial, part bureaucratic, and also part environmental. The only additional piece of information I would add is that I think that one doesn't want to be too deterministic, in that if you were to ask if Karl Marx had never written, would the Russian Revolution have looked the same? I think the answer is clearly no. I think that the situation is such that when people write in a way that's kind of compatible with the material circumstances, then the certain ideological demands on the part of the people or the intelligentsia become part of the environment to which the elite is responding and adapting. So basically, the ruling elite is a convergence of legal and commercial material interests who are trying to maximize their power and legitimacy in response, and insofar as the environment will permit, provided that we see ideological efforts on the part of theorists as something that can become part of the environment. I think I'll end there.
Okay, Swithun, final statements.
So I would say again that the ruling class are those who benefit directly from state, either in its privilege or taxation, and also have the means by which to make their pronouncements happen. So it's not the janitor, it's the guys at the top. So that's where I think the essence of the ruling class exists. Just a last point on legitimizing ideology. The one thing to note here is that most people don't think about what they think about. Most people think, well, they don't. They just believe. You have a few people who have ideas, and then this is disseminated via the culture through religious institutions, but now primarily through Hollywood and mass media, and people just imbibe general views. So, for example, would the gay rights movement have gone through such a revolution that it did without comedy shows making all the gays look good and all the people who didn't like, who were against homosexuality look really evil and nasty? Well, probably not. So when we talk about legitimizing ideology, we're not saying that everybody has a great theory about what legitimizes them, but rather there is an implicit, a tacit understanding of what makes them legitimate, and then they attempt to, when you ask them about it, cobble together something which is vaguely coherent or less coherent, depending who's saying it. So I think that's important to remember with respect to legitimizing ideology.
All right. Thanks again, Keith, Swithun, Right Ruminations. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.